Hello and welcome to the CBGA FTC interview series called Dialogues on Global Financial Transparency, which brings experts and distinguished academics to share their insights on contemporary issues in the field of global financial transparency and tax justice. This is the third conversation in the series. I am delighted to have with us today Dr. Matti Kohonen, who is going to speak to us on a very relevant topic, which is enabling an inclusive recovery in the post-pandemic world, particularly in the countries of the Global South. Before I begin, let me give you a brief overview of Matty's bio. Matti Kohonen is currently serving as the Director of Financial Transparency Coalition, or FTC, which is a global network of civil society organizations, governments, and experts that uses its wide reach and expertise to influence norms and standards for financial transparency and close loopholes in the global financial system. Matty has previously worked at Christian Aid as the principal advisor on the private sector. He has extensive experience also on the impact of financial and tax policies on developing countries and population, and is a founding member of Tax Justice Network and author of an edited volume, Tax Justice, Putting Global Inequality on the Agenda. Matty worked for a number of years in developing country-based analysis and proposals for progressive fiscal policies. He has also been actively involved in the financing for development process at the UN in promoting an end to illicit financial flows of all types, as well as abusive private financing that harms sustainable development, human rights, and environmental protection. Welcome, Matty.
Thanks for having me today.
So without further ado, we'll get started. The pandemic has exposed the inequalities in our societies in a stark form, with the economically and socially disadvantaged sections getting disproportionately affected by this crisis. A lot of unevenness has been witnessed between the economically advanced countries and the rest in terms of the fiscal response to the pandemic, with public spending measures in most countries in the Global South remaining far too limited compared to the needs. So maybe to get started, I'll ask you to tell us about your observations of this.
Thank you. We really see a very uneven recovery, both between countries and within countries, especially in the Global South. If in the Global North we see recovery spending in 2020 and extending to 2021 over 10% of GDP, we see that in the Global South countries for 2020, we saw about 4% of GDP recovery spending, and that is as low as less than 1% in many of the lowest income countries, such as countries like Sierra Leone. Countries like Nepal could not spend much of their budget for any recovery measures that would mitigate the cost of the pandemic, especially the poorest people, especially its gendered implications as well. So it is inadequate, but also it is uneven within the countries. So many of this is, of course, due to pre-existing preferences for helping the private sector over the crisis, rather than helping those people who are most impacted by loss of income and even food insecurity, hunger, and other types of areas, such as losing housing or losing access to essential basic services. Those were less of a focus of government interventions than helping the private sector with loans, or in some cases tax breaks, extending their tax payment holidays over the crisis. Some of those measures the private sector may have been needed, indeed extending deadlines to pay taxes and bills to the government, but it was disproportionate how much there was money given to the private sector, considering that more than 120 million people have been facing extreme poverty as a result, and possibly 100 million people are facing food insecurity, if not hunger, as a result. So the priorities were quite wrong. And of course, this was built in before the pandemic to our social protection systems and our sort of tax systems prior to the pandemic, that we weren't prepared to help the poor and scale up that support where it was needed.
So this brings me to my next question. we really need to understand how should the countries be responding as we move ahead on the road to recovery. As we know, many countries experienced a shrinking of or a slowdown in the growth of their economies and are yet to recover adequately despite some improvements in the current fiscal. In this context, what policy options should the governments be adopting towards ensuring sustainable and inclusive economic recovery in the coming years?
Yeah, so people maybe watch a bit too much the GDP growth figure as an indicator of recovery. Indeed, while that may be important for understanding a bit where the economy is, we need to really see where are the vulnerable people in the economy? How does this affect disproportionately more women, people living with disabilities or marginalized groups? And how is their income progressing, and how are their income gaps and labor market participation evolving during the pandemic? What we saw in the pandemic was a huge surge in the need for more care work from especially women. As a result of that need for more care work, when schools were closed and when people were needing help, they dropped out of the labor market, and they're finding it very difficult to get back into the labor market, many of whom were also in the informal sector, and are finding it difficult to kind of adjust because there are no ways of really adjusting once you've dropped out and once you're coming back. There are no sort of paid leave or no facilities for kind of contractually adjusting to that. So what we really see is that governments are looking far too much at the GDP figure, but they are not looking at the disproportionate impact of the pandemic with those most hurt. Now, the policy measures are then measures that would help those who have been most impacted, including having food distribution to mitigate hunger, income guarantees to protect against job losses, types of universal basic income payments that were trialed during the peak of the pandemic should actually continue. We saw maybe 6 months of income checks in countries such as South Africa, countries including some of the Latin American countries were doing basic income checks, but they did end after 6 months. But the incomes of those most hurt have actually not recovered after 6 months. So support should continue because they face long-term disruptions in being outside of work. And that also means that their household and family and personal incomes will suffer for, if not a decade, as a result of this, meaning that there's a lost decade of growth for those who are most hurt and impacted. We also need to make the tax system more progressive. So there have been calls for types of wealth taxes or dividend taxes. Taxing cryptocurrencies, like in India, is actually a progressive measure, considering who hold cryptocurrencies tends to be more towards the higher end of the income scale. But we should also look at other ways of taxing income, corporates and high wealth. Rather than cutting corporate taxes, we should be maintaining them where they are, if not increase for those who've seen windfalls. Especially there's a call for the pandemic profiteers, for companies and sectors who've done well out of the pandemic, may they be in energy or pharma, to face a bit higher taxes to pay for some of the social protection measures for those who've been most impacted. So the solidarity needs to be cross-sectoral and between those who've profited versus who've really have been hurt.
Great. So you did touch on that important point about women and girls being affected. I mean, we all know that the economic downturn accompanying the pandemic is pushing millions of people into extreme poverty, and women and girls are taking the hardest hit. So despite the clear gendered implications of the pandemic, policy response and recovery measures in many countries have not been gender responsive. What, according to you, I mean, if you want to share more, are some of the important measures other than what you have already discussed, which countries can adopt towards a gender responsive post-pandemic recovery?
Yeah, it is incredibly important to keep in mind that this is the first time since the Beijing Accord in 1995 that the income gap between men and women has risen consistently. It's been narrowing down as a result of policy measures by most governments and attitude shifting. We need to have a focus on getting this gap not widening further. And behind that gap is an invisible gap, which we're not measuring, which is the gap between the care work that men and women perform. And there are, of course, two ways of reducing the care work burden. Children need to be able to go to school, and also there needs to be consideration for countries to subsidize childcare and to provide longer maternity pay for women so that they will be able to recoup those incomes when they perform both child care, but also when they are on maternity. Those policies need to come in, even if they have a fiscal cost, because that fiscal cost could be brought back by having windfall taxes or taxes of different types of assets and wealth that are not currently taxed, and to make the system more progressive. We also need to look at the rise in gender-based violence and what are the measures, both budget but also policy measures, to really look at that. That's been, if you like, another invisible pandemic. Beyond helplines and beyond immediate help, there needs to be, areas where this pandemic of violence against women is taken seriously by all sorts of authorities that can put an end and stop to it, authorities including safe houses for women. So anything that can help to provide those areas that are budgetary measures as well need to be considered and funded progressively.
So let's pick up on that point that you made about taxation measures that the governments should be pursuing. On that, I just wanted to say that almost all countries require increased public resources to enable faster, inclusive, and sustained economic recovery. What kind of measures should governments adopt in this context in the domain of taxation and regulation of the financial services sector?
Yeah, so the greatest resources that governments have is actually their budget, and the greatest, therefore, lever of equity that governments have is how you finance that budget and what sort of assets are even considered as taxable assets that come under the tax system. So that's why it is tremendously important to make sure that everyone with a higher income is brought within an income tax system if it is not already the case. In many countries of the global south, the income tax paying group of people is tremendously narrow. I remember in parts of South Asia, especially, we saw that in Bangladesh, it is in less than 10% are income taxpayers out of the workforce. So it is important to bring people who are, and not everyone who is not paying income tax is informal and earning less than $5 a day either. So we need to extend the income tax bracket. We need to make sure that wealth is also taxed, because if we have a crisis of income inequality, we have an even bigger crisis of wealth inequality. And the unfortunate fact is that a good 20-30% of global wealth, especially in the global south, disproportionately so, we think about 10-15% globally at least, is held in offshore tax havens. So that offshore wealth, which was recently revealed in Swiss Secrets, in Pandora Papers, needs to be made visible. So it needs to be on a public registry if it's a company or trust. It needs to be exchanged between authorities if it's a bank account, and needs to be made so that either through a wealth tax or taxing the income from wealth, which wealth never sits idle, wealth always makes an income, that income can be taxed. And I was very positively surprised that India also decided to tax crypto asset sales as one way of recouping the huge asset bubble that we now have in about $2 trillion in crypto assets. And much of that is actually also held in the global south. So there are assets to be taxed, and those are necessary measures to be done instead of raising VAT or goods and service taxes that actually tends to hit the poorest and tends to hit female household members disproportionately when those taxes are raised. There's been a far too great of an emphasis on these indirect taxes as a way to raise revenue. And there's been a bit too much talk about those indirect taxes not having an inequality impact, which they do. The argument there is that if they're spent wisely, they don't. But we know that the spending doesn't reach those who are the poorest and most impacted by the indirect tax rises like VAT and GST. So they need to be considered much lower, and corporate taxes can be raised. Now, of course, that will need to be coordinated between countries. So if we raise corporate taxes, hopefully we have an equitable global minimum tax that raises the floor of corporate taxes and redistributes that to all countries, especially in the global south, because the previous global minimum tax proposal kept most of the revenue in headquarter countries of multinationals, which tend not to be countries in the global south. There are many measures to tax sort of unearned income and to make sort of share transactions and capital gains taxes taxable as well. So the whole host of measures should be looked at, and instead of raising taxes on the poorest.
Right. Let's move on to a very important topic, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs call for quite ambitious targets. Realistically speaking, are they still achievable by the 2030 deadline, especially by the countries in the global south? We really have to step up our game if we want to go there. So what kind of policy measures do you think should be promoted globally and nationally for ensuring that countries don't miss this important deadline?
So indeed, we're only 8 years away from the SDG deadline. The promise by 2030 to end extreme poverty, the promises to end hunger were made at that time in 2015, and many of us were there advocating for those goals. And we were told that those goals were ambitious and those goals needed more financing, therefore, because the gap in closing those SDG goals are financial and institutional. We are not spending anywhere enough funds to end hunger, to end poverty, to close the gaps between men and women in terms of gender equality, or indeed some of the environmental goals also have, budget implications and financing implications. So while the last years have been spent in talking about these things, we haven't actually seen an increase in financing, either international or seriously, shifting the domestic financial burden away from the people who need least support to those who need most support. So we actually, not only because of COVID, have a failure of SDGs, but the failure was built in before COVID, and COVID made that failure worse. We saw rising inequalities up to 2020 already in the first 10 years of the SDGs, and we were calling that rise in inequality, and that was a place to call for equitable measures, to have progressive taxation, to reveal the real owners of wealth and assets. Many of them are hiding those assets in offshore tax havens, which have been recently exposed in Swiss secrets or Pandora papers or other revelations. So we know that offshore secrecy also isn't over yet. So I think the challenges are huge, but at least during COVID, we've exposed those challenges. And I think one thing we have to learn from COVID is that we have to keep revealing those challenges and how they are impacting in a gendered way, how they're impacting on minorities or people living with disabilities more so. So we need to keep on monitoring this, and we need to keep on highlighting that. And by highlighting and monitoring, hope that people see, the common need to still achieve the SDGs. And essentially, we need a new financing for development summit to recover from the pandemic. Many in civil society have called for a recovery summit to be organized under the auspices of the United Nations, and in there to agree for ambitious financing measures to really look at what are the gaps in achieving the SDGs and how those gaps are still achievable. If we're talking of trillions or 2 or 3 trillion of financing to end extreme poverty and to end extreme hunger, those are absolutely achievable. So there is, of course, hope, because if there is the will, that sort of financing can be mobilized.
I would like to end this conversation with a question on a different note. What advice do you think is important to know for young researchers, activists, and policy professionals starting out in the field of financial transparency and tax justice?
I think my one set of advice is, don't always read this in the textbooks or in your classes. Unfortunately, textbooks will be 10 years out of date from how the financial system is currently working. I remember when I was studying economics and sociology in 2000 to 2003 as my bachelor's studies, there was no talk of offshore finance. There was absolutely zero talk of progressive taxation in those courses. They were talking about supply and demand. whereas we know that supply and demand is manipulated by traders who are trying to gain a short-term profit in very sort of speculative markets, especially when there's a crisis. So I learned most of my economics and sociology by talking to people in civil society, by talking and participating in types of student clubs, public lectures, online events these days. Absorb that information and get in touch, and don't hesitate emailing and contacting and talking to people who you find interesting. There is no substitute to direct knowledge and experience of those who are working on a subject in you getting to know more about it and possibly work on it yourself. However, don't neglect your courses. You still need to pass them with the knowledge that's about a decade late, because you do need to have a degree to work in any sector. So that would be my brief advice.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Matty. You have given us a lot to think about. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Cheers.